In the unforgiving summer of 1867, West Texas, Rose Whitaker and her young son Caleb clung to survival on their drought-stricken homestead by their fingernails. Then one scorching afternoon, destiny brought a dying Comanche warrior to their doorstep, his body riddled with bullet wounds and his spirit hovering between two worlds. Despite having barely enough water for themselves and facing certain danger from both settlers and soldiers alike, Rose couldn't turn away a human soul gasping for life. She dragged him into their small adobe shelter, used her last clean bandages and precious water to tend his wounds, and shared their final portion of cornmeal. Little did this desperate widow know that her act of mercy would not only save the mysterious warrior's life, but would unlock a future beyond her wildest imagination and forever change the course of her family's destiny. Rose Whitaker knelt before the simple wooden cross behind their adobe house, her weathered hands pressed together in prayer as the Texas sun beat down mercilessly on her bare head. The wood was rough beneath her fingers, still raw from the day 6 months ago when she and Caleb had hammered it into the hard earth. Carved into the crossbar were the words she could barely read through her tears anymore. Joseph Whitaker, beloved husband and father. 1831-1867. The cholera had taken him so fast, so brutally, that sometimes Rose still expected to see him walking in from the fields at sunset. His smile warm despite the day's hardships. She opened her eyes and stared at the parched land stretching endlessly around their small plot. The Rio Grande was 3 miles south, but it might as well have been 300. Their well had gone dry 2 weeks ago, and now she and 11-year-old Caleb had to make the dangerous trek to the river every other day, hauling back what water they could carry in their 2 remaining buckets. The garden Joseph had worked so hard to establish was nothing but withered stalks and cracked earth. The 3 chickens had stopped laying. The old mule Joseph had used for plowing had died last month, leaving them with no way to work what little viable land they had left. Rose stood slowly, her knees aching from kneeling on the sun-baked ground. At 32, she felt twice that age. Her hands, once soft and unmarked, were now calloused and scarred from the endless work of trying to maintain a homestead designed for a man's strength. Her dark hair, which Joseph had loved to see unbound in the evenings, was now perpetually tied back in a severe knot, streaked with premature grey from stress and grief. The sound of Caleb's voice calling from inside the house pulled her from her dark thoughts. She wiped her eyes quickly and straightened her faded dress, the same one she'd been wearing and washing for 3 months now. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, but she refused to let her son see her breakdown. He needed her to be strong, to be both mother and father now. Inside their small 2-room adobe dwelling, Caleb stood at their rickety table, carefully portioning out their breakfast. At 11, he'd grown tall and lean, all long limbs and serious eyes that held far too much understanding for his age. His sandy hair fell across his forehead as he concentrated on dividing their meager supplies with mathematical precision. 1 cup of cornmeal between them, half a strip of dried beef, a precious egg from 3 days ago that Rose had been saving. "Mama, I already ate," he said without looking up, pushing the larger portion toward her side of the table. It was a lie, and they both knew it. She could see the hollow of his cheeks, the way his shirt hung loose on his thinning frame. "Caleb Joseph Whitaker," Rose said firmly, using his full name the way she did when he was in trouble. "We'll split it even, just like we always do. Your father would have my hide if I let you go hungry while I ate. Papa would want you to keep your strength up," Caleb countered, his voice cracking slightly the way it had been doing lately as he edged toward manhood. "You work harder than me. You need more food." Rose crossed to him and placed her hands on his shoulders, looking directly into eyes that were the exact shade of blue Joseph's had been. "We're a family, son. We share everything equally, good times and bad. That's what your father taught us, and that's how we'll live." "Understood." Caleb nodded reluctantly, and Rose felt her heart clench at the sight of his forced acceptance. He was trying so hard to be the man of the house, to fill shoes that were far too large for his young feet. She wished desperately that she could give him the childhood he deserved, full of play and learning and carefree days. Instead, he spent his hours hauling water, checking traps, and helping her with the endless, back-breaking work that survival demanded. They ate in silence, making each bite last, chewing slowly to fool their stomachs into feeling fuller than they were. Through the small window, Rose could see the sun climbing higher, turning the landscape into a shimmering mirage of heat. It was going to be another scorcher, the kind of day where even breathing felt like inhaling fire. "I'll check the traps this morning," Caleb said, scraping the last of the cornmeal from his wooden bowl. "Maybe we got lucky and caught a rabbit? Take the shotgun," Rose instructed, though they both knew they had only 3 shells left, and she was saving those for true emergencies. "And stay close to the house. Don't go near the Martinez place." The Martinez family had packed up and left 2 weeks ago, joining the steady stream of settlers, abandoning their claims and heading back east or north to more forgiving lands. Their adobe stood empty now, already being reclaimed by the desert. Rose had watched them go with a mixture of envy and determination. She wouldn't run. This land, as harsh and unforgiving as it was, represented everything Joseph had worked for, everything he'd died still fighting to keep. She owed it to his memory to hold on as long as humanly possible. Caleb grabbed his hat, a battered thing that had been his father's, now stuffed with cloth to fit his smaller head. He picked up the shotgun with practiced ease, checking it the way Joseph had taught him before the cholera came. Rose watched him walk out into the brutal sunshine, his shadow long and thin on the dusty ground, and felt the familiar twist of fear in her gut. Every time he left her sight, she worried he wouldn't come back. She forced herself to turn to the day's chores. Water needed to be rationed for drinking, and the bare minimum of washing. The floor needed sweeping, though the dust would return within minutes. She needed to check their remaining supplies and calculate how many days they could stretch what little they had left. The banker in Fort Davis had given her until the end of August to make a payment on their land. That was 6 weeks away, and she had exactly $4.32 to her name. Rose was scrubbing their breakfast bowls with sand and a precious cup of water when she heard it. A sound that made her freeze, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs, hoofbeats coming fast. She dried her hands quickly and moved to the window, her mind racing through possibilities. Soldiers from Fort Davis. Unlikely, they rarely came this far south anymore. Comancheros, the mixed-blood traders who moved between the Comanche and the settlers. Possible but dangerous. Raiders. Her blood went cold at the thought. But as the rider came into view, Rose realized with a shock that it was Caleb, riding their neighbor's horse bareback, his face pale with fear and excitement. He pulled up hard in front of the house, dust billowing around him. "Mama!" he shouted, sliding off the horse before it had fully stopped. "Mama, you have to come quick. There's a man, he's hurt bad, bleeding everywhere. I think he's dying." Rose's medical training, limited as it was, kicked in immediately. She grabbed her basket of herbs and bandages, the supplies she'd carefully hoarded for emergencies. "Where is he? How far?" "Near the old cottonwood by the river bend," Caleb gasped, already moving to help her onto the horse. "Mama, he's Comanche. He's wearing war paint and everything. But he's hurt so bad, and I couldn't just leave him there to die." The words hit Rose like a physical blow. A Comanche warrior, in their territory, wounded. The implications raced through her mind at lightning speed. The army had been pushing the Comanche tribes harder this year, forcing them off their traditional hunting grounds. Skirmishes were common, bloody and brutal. If soldiers found out she'd helped a Comanche, she could be accused of aiding the enemy. If other Comanche found their warrior with settlers, they might think she and Caleb had attacked him. Either scenario could get them killed. But Rose looked at her son's face, at the desperate plea in his eyes, and knew there was only one choice she could make. Joseph had been a man who believed in basic human decency, who taught Caleb that every life had value, regardless of the color of skin or the language spoken. How could she turn away from those principles now? When a man was dying and her son had come to her for help, "Show me where," she said. settling onto the horse behind Caleb. "And pray we're not making the biggest mistake of our lives." They rode hard toward the river, the horse's hooves kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the still air. The cottonwood tree Caleb had mentioned was an ancient giant, its roots reaching deep enough to find water even in the worst droughts. It stood alone in the landscape, a landmark that everyone in the area knew. As they approached, Rose saw him. The Comanche warrior lay in the shade of the massive tree, his body twisted at an angle that spoke of tremendous pain. His chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths. Even from a distance, she could see the dark stains of blood on the dry earth around him. Caleb helped her down, and Rose approached slowly, her hands visible and empty. The warrior's eyes were closed, his face painted with traditional war markings, black and white stripes that stood out starkly against his bronze skin. He wore buckskin leggings and a breechcloth, his torso bare except for the blood that covered it. His long black hair was decorated with feathers and small bones. A knife in a beaded sheath lay just beyond his reach. Rose knelt beside him, her practiced eye assessing the damage. 2 bullet wounds, one high on his left shoulder, another in his side just below the ribs. Both were still bleeding, though the flow had slowed. His breathing was labored, each breath accompanied by a wet sound that suggested lung involvement. His skin was hot to the touch, fever already setting in. "Caleb, I need you to ride back to the house," Rose said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Bring blankets, all our water, the large pot, and whatever clean cloth we have left." "Can you do that?" "Yes, Mama," Caleb said, his voice tight with worry. "Is he going to die?" "Not if I can help it," Rose replied, already opening her basket and pulling out what supplies she had. "Now go, quickly." As Caleb rode away, Rose turned her full attention to the dying man before her. She'd helped Joseph tend to injuries before, both animal and human. Frontier life was harsh, and medical knowledge was a necessity for survival. But this was different. The wounds were severe, the blood loss significant. Without proper medicine, without even basic surgical tools, her chances of saving him were slim. Still, she had to try. Rose cut away the buckskin around his wounds with her sewing scissors, revealing the full extent of the damage. The shoulder wound had gone clean through, which was good. The side wound was more concerning. She could see the bullet was still lodged inside, and probing for it without proper instruments could do more harm than good. The warrior's eyes suddenly opened, startling her. They were dark and intense, filled with pain but also with a fierce intelligence. He spoke in Comanche, words she couldn't understand, his voice rough and weak. Then to her surprise, he switched to broken English. "White woman," he rasped. "Why you help Seiko?" "Enemy?" Rose met his gaze steadily, her hands never stopping their work as she packed the shoulder wound with clean moss from her basket. "Because you're hurt, and no person should die alone under the sun. My name is Rose Whitaker. That was my son Caleb who found you." Seiko's eyes drifted closed again, but she saw the corner of his mouth twitch slightly. "Rose?" he repeated, the name strange in his accent. "Seiko means hunter in your tongue. I hunt for my people. Well, Seiko the hunter, you're going to need to fight hard if you want to see your people again," Rose said firmly, tearing strips from her spare petticoat to use as bandages. "These wounds are bad, but I've seen men survive worse. Do you understand me?" He nodded weakly. "Understand. Blue coats shoot me. 2 days, maybe 3, I run. Horse killed, I walk. No water." His voice was fading, exhaustion and blood loss pulling him back under. "Save your strength," Rose instructed, working quickly to staunch the bleeding. "Don't try to talk." But Seiko's hand suddenly gripped her wrist with surprising strength, his eyes opening one more time. "White woman Rose," he said, his voice urgent despite its weakness. "Soldiers come. They track me. You danger. Leave Seiko. Save you. Save boy." Rose looked at the desperation in his eyes, the genuine concern for her and Caleb's safety, despite his own dire condition. In that moment, she saw not an enemy warrior, not a savage, as the army called them, but simply a man who didn't want his rescue to cost innocent lives. "My husband taught me that doing the right thing is often the hardest thing," Rose said quietly, gently removing her wrist from his grip. and leaving you here to die would haunt me for the rest of my days. So you're going to have to trust me, Seiko. Just like I'm trusting you not to hurt my boy or me once you're strong enough to move." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that transcended language and culture. Seiko's hand relaxed, his head falling back against the earth. "Trust," he whispered, and then his eyes closed again. Caleb returned with the supplies, his face anxious as he helped his mother work. Together, they cleaned the wounds as best they could, packed them with herbs Rose knew had healing properties, and bound them tightly with strips of cloth. They fashioned a travois from branches and blankets, and with tremendous effort managed to get Seiko's unconscious body onto it. "We're taking him home?" Caleb asked, his voice uncertain as they secured the travois to the horse. Rose looked at her son, seeing the conflict in his young face. Fear warring with compassion, practical concerns battling against moral conviction. "Yes," she said firmly. "We're taking him home. And if anyone asks, we found an injured man and did our Christian duty. Nothing more, nothing less." The journey back to their homestead was agonizingly slow. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Seiko drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes crying out in Comanche, sometimes lying frighteningly still. Rose walked beside the travois, one hand on the warrior's chest, monitoring his breathing and heart rate. When they finally reached the adobe house, the shadows were growing long. Rose and Caleb managed to get Seiko inside, laying him on Rose's own bed. It was the coolest room in the house, and he needed every advantage in fighting the fever that was surely coming. As Rose bathed the warrior's face with precious water, washing away the war paint to reveal surprisingly noble features beneath, she couldn't help but think of the irony. 6 months ago, she'd been a respectable widow, struggling but maintaining her position in frontier society. Now she was harboring a Comanche warrior in her home, risking everything for a man most of her neighbors would shoot on sight. "Mama," Caleb said softly from the doorway, "did we do the right thing?" Rose looked at her son, then at the dying man on her bed, and finally at the cross visible through the window where Joseph lay buried. "I don't know, sweetheart," she answered honestly. "But it's the only thing we could do and still live with ourselves. Your father would have done the same." As night fell over the West Texas desert, Rose Whitaker sat beside the bed of a Comanche warrior, watching his labored breathing and praying that her act of mercy wouldn't destroy the fragile life she and Caleb had managed to preserve. She didn't know that outside, in the gathering darkness, other eyes were watching their small adobe house. She didn't know that the choice she'd made that day would set in motion events that would change everything she thought she knew about survival, about honor, and about the unexpected places where salvation could be found. The fever came with the force of a prairie storm, turning Seiko's body into a furnace that no amount of cool water could quench. Rose spent 3 sleepless nights at his bedside, changing sweat-soaked cloths, forcing water between his cracked lips, and fighting to keep the infection from spreading through his wounds. Caleb helped without complaint, taking turns watching over their patient, while Rose caught brief moments of exhausted sleep in the chair beside the bed. On the 4th morning, when Rose was beginning to fear all their efforts had been for nothing, Seiko's eyes finally opened with clarity, instead of the fevered delirium that had possessed him. "Water," he rasped in English, his voice weak but coherent. Rose quickly brought a cup to his lips, supporting his head as he drank in small, careful sips. His dark eyes followed her movements with an intensity that made her aware of how close she stood, how vulnerable she was. But when he finished drinking and lay back against the pillow, there was no threat in his gaze, only exhaustion, and something that might have been gratitude. "How long?" Seiko asked, his hand moving slowly to touch the bandages wrapped around his torso. Rose gently pushed his hand away before he could disturb the careful dressing. 4 days since Caleb found you," Rose replied, settling back into her chair. "You've been fighting hard, Seiko. The fever broke just before dawn. You're not out of danger yet, but you're past the worst of it." Siko's eyes closed briefly, and Rose saw his lips move in what might have been a prayer or words of thanks in his own language. When he looked at her again, there was a question in his expression. "Why?" he asked simply. "Comanche kill settlers. Settlers kill Comanche. Why you save enemy?" Rose was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. Through the window, she could see Caleb drawing water from their nearly empty rain barrel, his thin shoulders straining with the effort. "My husband used to say that hate is easy, but it takes real strength to show mercy," she said finally. He believed that every person, regardless of who they are or where they come from, deserves a chance at life. "I couldn't let you die out there, not when I had the means to help." "Your husband," Siko said, his eyes moving to the simple gold band Rose still wore on her left hand. "He is dead," Rose answered quietly. 6 months ago. Cholera took him in 3 days. Understanding flickered across Siko's face. "My wife also gone," he said after a moment. 2 winters passed. Sickness from the white man's forts. She and our daughter, both taken to the spirit world in same moon. The shared grief hung between them like a tangible thing, a bridge across the vast divide of their different worlds. Rose found herself looking at this Comanche warrior with new eyes, seeing not an enemy, but a fellow survivor. Someone who understood the particular loneliness of losing a partner and being left to navigate life alone. "I'm sorry for your loss," Rose said softly. "No one should have to bury their child." Siko nodded, his eyes distant with memory. 10 summers she lived, bright like morning star, laughed like water over stones. His hand moved to touch a small leather pouch that hung on a cord around his neck, something Rose had noticed but not removed. "I carry piece of her dress. To remember." Rose felt tears prick her eyes. She understood that need to hold on to physical reminders, the way she still slept on Joseph's side of the bed sometimes, breathing in the fading scent of him in the pillow. "What was her name?" she asked. "Kimimela," Seko said, a sad smile touching his lips. "Means butterfly in your tongue. She chased them in the meadows, trying to catch them to bring to her mother." Before Rose could respond, the sound of horses approaching made both of them freeze. Seko's hand immediately went to his side, searching for a weapon that wasn't there. Rose moved quickly to the window, her heart pounding. 3 riders were coming up the path to the house, and even from a distance, she could see the blue uniforms of cavalry soldiers. "Soldiers," she hissed. Turning back to Siko, "You need to hide." "Cannot walk," Siko said through gritted teeth, trying to sit up and failing. The movement reopened his side wound, and fresh blood began to seep through the bandage. "Leave me. Tell them you know nothing." "I will do no such thing," Rose said firmly, her mind racing. She grabbed a quilt from the chest at the foot of the bed and threw it over Seko, arranging it to look like rumpled bedding. "You're my cousin from back east, come to help with the farm. You caught fever on the journey. Don't speak, don't move, and for God's sake don't let them see those wounds." Caleb burst through the door, his face pale. "Mama, soldiers coming. What do we do?" "Follow my lead," Rose instructed, smoothing her hair and apron with hands that trembled slightly. "And remember, we have nothing to hide. We're just taking care of a sick relative." The knock on the door came hard and authoritative. Rose took a deep breath, sent up a quick prayer, and opened it to find a lieutenant flanked by 2 privates. The officer was young, maybe 25, with the kind of rigid bearing that spoke of Eastern Military Academy training and very little actual frontier experience. "Ma'am," the lieutenant said, touching his hat brim in a perfunctory greeting. "Lieutenant William Garrett, Fort Davis. We're tracking a hostile Comanche who attacked a supply wagon 4 days ago. Killed 2 teamsters and wounded a 3rd. You seen any sign of Indians in the area?" Rose's stomach clenched at the description, but she kept her face carefully neutral. "No, Lieutenant. We keep close to the house these days. Haven't seen anyone except neighbors heading east. Mind if we look around?" Garrett asked, though his tone suggested it wasn't really a question. His eyes moved past Rose to the interior of the small house, taking in their poverty with the casual dismissal of someone who'd never known true hardship. "My cousin is inside, sick with fever," Rose said, blocking the doorway with her body. "I'd rather not disturb him. He's been delirious for days, cousin. Garrett's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Didn't know you had family in the area, Mrs. Whitaker. From Illinois, Rose improvised quickly. My late husband's cousin. He came west looking for work, took ill on the journey. We're doing what we can for him. One of the privates, an older man with a scar across his cheek, was studying Caleb with sharp eyes. Boy looks scared, he observed. Something's spooking you, son. Caleb swallowed hard, and Rose could see him fighting to control his fear. Just worried about my cousin, sir, he managed. And we don't get many visitors. Makes a body nervous. Garrett dismounted, clearly intent on searching the house, regardless of Rose's protests. Won't take but a minute, ma'am. Just doing our duty. Rose had no choice but to step aside, her heart hammering so hard she was sure they could hear it. She watched helplessly as Garrett and his men entered the small adobe dwelling, their heavy boots loud on the packed earth floor. They looked through the few possessions in the main room, opened the chest where Rose kept her meager supplies, and then Garrett moved toward the bedroom where Seiko lay hidden. Please, Rose said, her voice catching. He needs his rest. But Garrett pushed open the door anyway, his hand resting on his pistol. Rose held her breath as the lieutenant approached the bed, where a figure lay completely covered by the quilt, only the top of a head visible. The room was dim, shutters closed against the heat, and Rose had deliberately not lit the lamp. "Cousin!" Garrett called out sharply. "You awake?" Seiko had the presence of mind to groan weakly, shifting under the quilt in a way that suggested fevered restlessness. Rose moved quickly to the bedside, placing herself between the soldier and her patient. "He doesn't know where he is half the time," she said, laying a hand on the quilt-covered shoulder. "The fever comes and goes. I've been trying to keep him cool, but in this heat—" She let the sentence trail off meaningfully. Garrett stood there for a long moment, his eyes scanning the room. Rose could see him taking in the basin of water on the nightstand, the damp cloths hanging over the chair, the herbs and medicine bottles arranged on the small table. It looked exactly like what she'd claimed, a sick room where a desperate woman was fighting to save a fevered patient. "How long's he been like this?" Garrett asked, but his tone had shifted slightly, less suspicious and more uncomfortable. Young officers from back east often had little experience with serious illness, and the spectre of contagion made even the bravest men nervous. 5 days now, Rose answered, which was almost true. Started with chills, then the fever set in. I'm worried it might be the cholera again. The word had its desired effect. Garrett took an involuntary step backward, his hand moving away from his pistol to cover his mouth and nose. Cholera was the nightmare of every frontier settlement, killing with terrifying speed and no respect for rank or position. "You should have reported this to the fort," Garrett said, but he was already moving toward the door. "Cholera needs to be contained." "It might not be cholera," Rose said quickly, following him out of the bedroom. "Could just be regular fever. I didn't want to raise an alarm until I was certain." Garrett was eager to leave now, his mission to find the Comanche warrior forgotten in the face of potential disease. "Keep him isolated," he ordered, "and if anyone else shows symptoms, you send word to Fort Davis immediately." "Understood. Yes, Lieutenant," Rose said, relief flooding through her as she watched the soldiers mount their horses. "Thank you for your concern." As the cavalry rode away in a cloud of dust, Rose sagged against the doorframe, her legs suddenly weak. Caleb rushed to her side, his young face tight with the stress of maintaining their deception. "That was close, Mama," he whispered. "Too close, I know, baby," Rose said, pulling him into a tight embrace. "But we did it. We kept him safe." They went back inside to find Seiko had pushed the quilt aside and was watching them with an expression Rose couldn't quite read. His chest wound had reopened during the tense encounter, and blood was seeping through the bandage again, but his eyes were alert and focused. "You lie to blue coats for Seiko," he said, his voice stronger than it had been. "Put yourself in danger. Your son in danger. Why?" Rose moved to the bed and began carefully unwrapping the soiled bandage, her hands steady, despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "Because it was the right thing to do," she said simply. And because I gave you my word that I'd help you, and I don't break my promises." Seiko caught her hand, stopping her ministrations. His grip was firm but gentle, and when Rose met his eyes, she saw something profound there, a depth of respect and gratitude that transcended their different worlds. "Rose Whitaker has honor," he said solemnly. "Seiko will remember this. My people will remember this." "I don't need remembering," Rose said, gently freeing her hand to continue tending his wound. "I just need you to heal, so you can go back to your people. That's payment enough." But as she cleaned the reopened wound and applied fresh bandages, Rose couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted between them. She'd crossed a line today, lying to the military to protect a Comanche warrior. There would be consequences if the truth ever came out, serious ones. Yet looking at Seiko's face, seeing the fierce intelligence and fundamental decency in his eyes, she couldn't bring herself to regret the choice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Over the next week, Seiko's recovery progressed steadily. He was strong, Rose realized, with the kind of physical resilience that came from a lifetime spent in harsh conditions. Soon, he was able to sit up without assistance, then to stand for brief periods, leaning heavily on a walking stick Caleb had fashioned for him. His appetite returned, though Rose had precious little to feed him beyond thin soup and cornmeal mush. "You have no food," Seiko observed one evening as Rose divided their meager dinner into 3 portions. "No water in your well, no animals for meat. How you live like this?" Rose bristled at the question, pride making her defensive. "We manage," she said shortly. "We've survived this long, we'll keep surviving." But Seiko's expression wasn't judgmental or pitying. It was assessing, the look of someone calculating a problem and working out solutions. "The boy," he said, nodding toward where Caleb sat by the window, practicing his letters on a slate. "He is strong, but too thin. You work too hard, eat too little. This cannot continue. We do what we have to do," Rose replied, her voice tight. "When the rains come, the well will fill again. When the garden grows back, we'll have vegetables. We're not the only ones struggling out here, Seiko. Half the homesteads in this territory are in the same position." Seiko was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes thoughtful. "When Seiko is strong," he said finally, "I show you where water runs beneath the ground, where deer come to drink at dawn, where wild onions grow in the canyon. Your husband, he teach you to survive like white people. Seiko teach you to survive like Comanche." Rose looked at him in surprise. "You do that? Share your people's knowledge with us. You save Seiko's life," he replied with simple dignity. "Life debt must be repaid. This is Comanche way. Honor demands it. We didn't help you expecting repayment," Rose protested, but Seiko shook his head firmly. "This I know," he said. "That is why debt is real. You give help with no thought of gain. That is greatest gift. Now Seiko must give back, not because you demand, but because honor demands." Caleb had been listening to the exchange, his young face fascinated. "Could you really teach us how to find water?" he asked eagerly. "Papa tried to dig a new well before he died, but he never found the right spot." Seiko smiled at the boy's enthusiasm, and Rose was struck by how the expression transformed his face. Without the war paint, with his wounds healing and color returning to his skin, he was a handsome man, probably close to her own age. The hardness that had marked him when he first arrived was softening, revealing glimpses of the person he'd been before grief and warfare had carved lines into his features. "Seiko teach you many things," he told Caleb. "How to track animals by signs in earth, how to call birds close for catching, how to find plants that heal and plants that feed. You want to learn?" "Yes, sir." Caleb's eyes were shining with an excitement Rose hadn't seen since Joseph's death. The boy had been so serious for so long, shouldering responsibilities far beyond his years. To see him animated and eager again made Rose's heart swell with complicated emotions. "Then we begin tomorrow," Seiko decided. "If your mother permits—" Both males turned to look at Rose expectantly, and she found herself smiling despite her concerns. "I suppose it couldn't hurt to learn," she admitted. "Lord knows we could use all the help we can get." That night, after Caleb had fallen asleep on his pallet in the corner, Rose sat at the table recording the day's events in Joseph's old journal. She'd taken to writing things down lately, feeling the need to document this strange chapter of their lives. As her pen moved across the paper, she became aware of Seiko watching her from the bed. "You make marks that speak," he observed. "This is powerful medicine." "It's just writing," Rose said, but she understood what he meant. The ability to preserve thoughts and events beyond the limits of memory was indeed a kind of power. "My husband taught me when we first married. He said an educated woman was a strong woman. Your husband was wise man," Seiko said. Seiko sees this in the son he left behind, in the wife who fights to keep his dreams alive. Rose felt tears threaten at the unexpected understanding in his words. "Some days I don't know if I'm fighting or just refusing to accept defeat," she admitted quietly. "The land is so hard, Seiko. Sometimes I think Joseph's dreams died with him." "Dreams not die," Seiko said firmly. "Dreams change, grow, become new things. Like river that finds new path when old path blocked. You and boy, you are like river. You find new way." Rose looked at this Comanche warrior who had appeared in their lives like a character from one of Caleb's adventure stories, and wondered what new path he might represent. She'd saved his life out of basic human decency, expecting nothing in return. But now, as he grew stronger each day, she began to sense that his presence here was part of something larger, some design she couldn't yet see. "Tell me about your people," she said impulsively. "About your life before all this." And Seiko, perhaps feeling the same strange connection that was growing between them, began to speak. He told her of the great buffalo herds that had once darkened the plains for miles, of following the seasonal migrations with his band, of the freedom of living in harmony with the land rather than trying to conquer it. He spoke of his wife and daughter with a tenderness that made Rose's heart ache, of the life they'd built together before sickness and war had torn his world apart. As the oil lamp burned low and the desert night pressed against the small adobe house, Rose listened to Seiko's stories and felt something fundamental shifting inside her. The world was so much larger than she'd understood, full of different ways of living and being. Joseph had been a good man, a kind man, but his vision had been limited by his culture and upbringing. Seiko was showing her possibilities she'd never imagined, ways of surviving that didn't require endless brutal labor and slow starvation. "Thank you," she said when he finally fell silent, exhaustion catching up with him. "For trusting me with your stories." "Thank you," Seiko replied, his eyes already drooping toward sleep. "For seeing Seiko as man, not as enemy. For teaching son to do same. This is gift greater than life." As Rose banked the fire and prepared for bed, she thought about gifts and debts, about enemies and friends, about the strange and unexpected ways that life could change direction. She'd rescued a dying Comanche warrior, expecting nothing but the satisfaction of doing the right thing. Instead, she was beginning to suspect she'd found something far more valuable, a guide who could teach them how to truly live in this harsh land. And perhaps, though she barely dared to acknowledge the thought, a friend in the loneliest time of her life, 2 weeks after the soldier's visit. Seiko declared himself strong enough to begin repaying his debt. Rose woke before dawn to find him already dressed and waiting by the door, his wounds still bandaged, but his movements no longer stiff with pain. The morning air was cool, a brief respite before the sun would turn the desert into an oven, and Caleb practically vibrated with excitement as Seiko led them away from the homestead toward the rocky hills to the west. "Your husband, he dig for water here," Seiko said, pointing to a depression in the earth where Joseph had abandoned his well project. "He dig in wrong place. White men think water is underneath, must go down. Sometimes yes, but not here." Rose looked at the hole that had cost Joseph weeks of back-breaking labor and ultimately nothing. "Then where?" she asked, trying to keep the frustration from her voice. They'd wasted so much time and effort on that failed well. Seiko knelt on the ground, his hands moving over the earth with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his warrior's bearing. "Water does not hide," he said. "Water speaks to those who know how to listen." He gestured for Caleb to join him. "You see this grass here? Still green when all else brown. You see this rock, wet on bottom when sun should dry it. Water tells story for those with eyes to see." For the next hour, Seiko taught them to read the landscape the way his people had for generations. He showed them how certain plants only grew where water ran close to the surface, how morning dew collected differently in areas with underground streams, how the flight patterns of birds at dawn could reveal hidden springs. Rose found herself fascinated, realizing how much knowledge she'd been blind to, living on this land for 3 years without truly understanding it. "Here," Seiko finally said, standing in a spot about 50 yards from Joseph's abandoned well. "Dig here. Water runs strong beneath this place. 3-man heights down, maybe less. How can you be sure?" Rose asked, though something in his certainty made her want to believe him. Seiko smiled, a rare expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Seiko's father teach him. His father's father teach him. Back many generations, Comanche learned to find water or die in desert. This knowledge is our survival." Over the next 3 days, Rose and Caleb dug where Seiko indicated. He helped when his strength allowed, though Rose insisted he not strain his healing wounds. The work was brutal, the earth hard and stubborn, but they persisted. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Caleb's shovel struck mud, then wet sand, and suddenly water was seeping into the bottom of their new well. "It's really here," Caleb shouted, his face transformed with joy. "Mama, we have water again." Rose felt tears streaming down her face as she watched the well fill, slowly but steadily. It wasn't just about having water, though that was vital. It was about hope, about the possibility that they could not only survive, but actually thrive here. She turned to Seiko, who was watching their celebration with quiet satisfaction. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate for the magnitude of what he'd given them. "You've saved our lives. Now we are equal," Seiko replied. "You save Seiko, Seiko save you. But debt not finished. I promise to teach, and Comanche keep promises." True to his word, Seiko's teachings continued. He showed Caleb how to set snares that actually caught rabbits instead of scaring them away. He taught them both which desert plants were edible, which had medicinal properties, and which were deadly poison. He demonstrated how to preserve meat by drying it in the sun with salt and herbs, making their meager catches last far longer. Under his guidance, their diet improved dramatically within a week, but it was the hunting lesson that proved most transformative. Seiko had been watching Caleb struggle with Joseph's old rifle, the boy's shots consistently missing their targets. One morning, Seiko emerged from the house carrying something Rose hadn't seen before. A bow he'd crafted in secret during his recovery, using materials he'd gathered around their property. "Gun is good weapon," Seiko said, placing the bow in Caleb's hands. "But gun makes noise, scares all game for miles. Gun needs bullets you cannot make. Bow is silent. A bow needs only wood and stone and sinew, things the land provides freely." Caleb's eyes widened as he examined the weapon, his fingers tracing the smooth curve of the wood. "You made this?" "For me, for you," Seiko confirmed. "Now I teach you to use it. White men think shooting is about strength, about forcing the arrow to fly. Comanche way is about becoming one with the weapon, with the target, with the wind itself." Rose watched as Seiko positioned Caleb's body, adjusting his stance, his grip, his breathing. There was a patience in his teaching that reminded her of Joseph, but also something different, a spiritual dimension to the instruction that went beyond mere technique. He spoke to Caleb of respecting the animals they hunted, of taking only what was needed, of thanking the spirit of each creature that gave its life for their survival. "You don't just aim at the deer," Seiko explained. "You see yourself as the deer, understand its thoughts, predict where it will move. Then you become the arrow, flying true to meet it. This is the way." It took days of practice, but gradually Caleb's shots improved. Rose could see her son's confidence growing, his shoulders straightening, his movements becoming more assured. He was learning more than hunting, she realized. He was learning to trust himself, to believe in his own capabilities in a way he hadn't since Joseph's death. The morning Caleb brought down his first deer with the bow, Rose thought her heart might burst with pride. Seko performed a brief ceremony, teaching Caleb to honor the animal's sacrifice, and together they field-dressed it properly so nothing was wasted. That night they had their first real feast in months, and Rose found herself laughing at Caleb's excited retelling of the hunt, his words tumbling over each other in his enthusiasm. "Did you see how it just stood there, Mama? Like Seko said it would, right at the edge of the clearing. And I remembered everything he taught me about breathing and being still inside. And the arrow flew perfect, just perfect." Seko caught Rose's eye across the fire, and the understanding that passed between them needed no words. They were both thinking the same thing, watching this boy who'd been forced to grow up too fast, finally being allowed to experience the joy of accomplishment, of mastery, of becoming who he was meant to be. But not everyone in the territory was pleased with the changes at the Whitaker homestead. Rose had been so focused on survival and on Seko's teachings that she'd failed to notice the attention they were drawing. It was Martha Jenkins, the banker's wife, who brought the town's concerns directly to their door. "Rose Whitaker, I'm speaking to you as a Christian woman and a friend," Martha said, standing rigid in her Sunday dress despite the weekday and the heat. Her eyes kept darting toward where Seko sat on the porch, working on a new project, his presence impossible to ignore or explain away. "People are talking. They say you've got an Indian living here, sleeping under your roof with you and your boy. It's not decent, Rose. It's not safe." Rose felt her spine stiffen, anger rising hot in her chest. "That Indian is my husband's cousin, as I've told everyone who's asked. He's been sick with fever, and we've been caring for him. I didn't realize Christian charity had become indecent." "Don't play innocent with me," Martha said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I've seen Indians before. I know what they look like, how they move. That man is Comanche, Rose. The same savages who've been raiding and killing settlers for decades. How can you harbor one of them?" "He saved my life." Caleb's voice came from the doorway, surprising both women. He stepped out onto the porch, moving to stand beside Seko with deliberate solidarity. "Seko found where the water runs beneath our land. He taught me how to hunt properly. He's helped us more than anyone else in this whole territory, including all those fine Christian folks who crossed the street to avoid us when Papa died." Martha's face flushed red. "Boy, you don't understand what you're dealing with. These people are dangerous. They're not civilized like us. They don't think the same way." "You're right," Rose said coldly. "They don't think the same way. Seko thinks that when someone is dying, you help them instead of leaving them to suffer. He thinks that when someone shows you kindness, you repay it with loyalty and teaching. He thinks that children should be taught skills that will actually help them survive, not just pretty manners that mean nothing when you're starving." "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Jenkins. He doesn't think like us at all." Martha drew herself up, her expression a mixture of shock and righteous indignation. "The people of this territory won't stand for this, Rose. The army won't stand for it. You're putting all of us in danger by harboring a hostile—" "Seko is not hostile," Rose interrupted. "He's a man who was wounded and left to die, who we helped out of basic human decency. If that makes us dangerous, then I suppose we're guilty as charged." "You'll regret this," Martha said, turning to leave. "Mark my words, Rose Whitaker. No good can come from mixing with savages. You're going to bring disaster down on that boy's head, and it'll be on your conscience." After Martha had climbed into her buggy and driven away in a cloud of dust and disapproval, Rose sagged against the porch post, the confrontation leaving her drained. She felt Seko's presence beside her before he spoke. "Woman speaks from fear," he said quietly. "Fear makes people cruel, makes them see enemies where there are none. Seko should leave before bringing more trouble to this house." "No," Rose said firmly, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. "You're not going anywhere until you're completely healed. I won't let narrow-minded gossips drive you away." "Mama's right," Caleb added. You promised to teach me how to track, remember? And how to read the weather signs. You can't leave yet." Seiko looked between them, his expression unreadable. "You do not fear what others think? What they might do?" Rose met his dark eyes steadily. "I'm more afraid of becoming the kind of person who turns her back on someone who needs help just because it's inconvenient or unpopular. My husband didn't raise our son to be a coward, and I won't become one now." Something shifted in Seiko's expression, a warmth entering his eyes that Rose had never seen before. "White men have saying," he said softly. "Judge a man by the company he keeps. Seiko thinks it should be other way. Judge a man by whether he keeps his word when it becomes difficult. Rose Whitaker keeps her word. This is true strength." The moment hung between them, charged with something Rose didn't want to examine too closely. She was aware of how close they stood, of the way the afternoon sun caught the highlights in his dark hair, of the respect and something deeper reflected in his gaze. She cleared her throat and stepped back, suddenly flustered. "Well," she said briskly, "we should prepare something for dinner. Caleb, why don't you check your snares? Seiko, you shouldn't be standing so long yet." "Your side, my side heals well," Seiko said, but he didn't move away. "Rose, the woman who came today, she speaks truth about one thing. Danger comes from Seiko being here. Not from Seiko himself, but from those who fear what they do not understand. I think maybe soldiers come back. Maybe others come. You must be prepared." "Prepared how?" Rose asked, feeling a chill despite the heat. "I teach you to defend yourself," Seiko said, "and I teach you to disappear if you must. Comanche know how to vanish into the land, how to leave no trail for enemies to follow. These are skills you need in this territory, whether Seiko stays or goes." Over the following week, Seiko's teachings took a different turn. He showed Rose and Caleb how to read tracks, not just animal tracks but human ones, how to tell how many riders had passed, how long ago, whether they were military or civilian. He taught them to recognize the signs of approaching danger, the way birds fell silent before intruders, the way dust rose in distinctive patterns depending on how many horses were being ridden. He also taught them to hide. There was a small cave in the hills, about a mile from their homestead, accessible only by a narrow path that was easy to miss if you didn't know where to look. Seiko showed them how to stock it with emergency supplies, how to cover their tracks when approaching it, how to wait out danger in silence and stillness. "You think like hunted animal," he explained as they arranged dried meat and water containers in the cave. "Always know where safety is. Always have escape path. This is how Comanche survive when blue coats hunt us like animals." Rose hated that they needed these lessons, hated the reality of a world where her son had to learn to hide and run and fight. But she was also grateful. Seiko was giving them tools for survival that went far beyond finding water and hunting game. He was teaching them to navigate a dangerous world with intelligence rather than just fear. One evening, as they sat around the fire after another day of lessons, Caleb asked the question Rose had been wondering herself. "Seiko, why do you stay? You're strong enough to travel now. You could go back to your people. Why do you keep teaching us?" Seiko was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but clear. "When Seiko's wife and daughter died, I wanted to die too. I rode into battles hoping for death, took risks that were foolish, not brave. The night blue coats shot me, part of me was glad. Thought finally the pain would end." He looked up, his eyes meeting Rose's across the fire. "But then I wake up here. I see woman who lost her husband, boy who lost his father, both still fighting to live, to build something good from grief. I see courage I had forgotten. I see reason to choose life instead of death." Rose felt tears burning in her eyes. "We're not courageous," she said hoarsely. "We're just doing what we have to do. That is what courage is," Seiko replied. "Doing what must be done, even when heart is broken, even when world is hard. You show Seiko this. Now Seiko stays to show you that you are stronger than you know, that you can survive anything." Caleb had moved closer to Seiko, and now he asked tentatively, "Will you tell us more about your daughter, about Kimimela?" Seko's hand went to the small pouch he always wore around his neck, his fingers touching it gently. "She would have liked you," he said to Caleb. "She was curious like you, always asking questions, always wanting to learn. She would chase rabbits in the camp, convinced she could catch them with her bare hands." He smiled at the memory, the expression bittersweet. "What would she think of us?" Caleb asked. "Of me learning Comanche ways." "She would think it wise," Seko said. "She would say that learning from others makes us bigger, not smaller. That wisdom comes from listening to all voices, not just those that sound like our own." Rose listened to Seko talk about his daughter, watched the way Caleb hung on every word, and felt something profound settling into place inside her chest. This strange family they'd become, formed by circumstance and choice rather than blood, was teaching all of them how to live again. Seko was learning that life could have purpose after devastating loss. Caleb was learning that strength came in many forms, and Rose herself was learning that the future didn't have to look like the past, that new beginnings could grow from the ruins of old dreams. At night, after Caleb had fallen asleep, Rose found Seko sitting outside, studying the stars. She settled beside him, comfortable in the silence they'd learned to share. "The banker comes tomorrow," she said quietly. "I got a notice yesterday. He wants payment on the land, or he'll start foreclosure proceedings." "You have money?" Seko asked. "Not enough," Rose admitted. "Not nearly enough. I've been hoping for a miracle, but I think maybe my time has run out." Seko was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Seko's people, we do not understand white man's way of owning land. Land belongs to itself, to the spirits, to all who need it. This idea that paper gives right to earth seems strange." "I don't disagree," Rose said with a tired laugh. "But strange or not, it's the law. And if I can't pay, they'll take our home. Then we find a way," Seko said simply. "We survive by adapting, by being clever, by using all weapons available. You taught Seko that sometimes the greatest weapon is mercy, is kindness unexpected. Now we find what weapon will work against man who wants your land." Rose looked at him in the starlight. This Comanche warrior who'd become her teacher, her friend. Perhaps something more that neither of them was ready to name. "What did I do to deserve you appearing in my life?" she asked softly. "You did nothing," Seko replied, his voice equally soft. "You just chose to see a dying man instead of an enemy. Sometimes the greatest gifts come from the simplest choices." As they sat together under the vast Texas sky, Rose felt the weight of tomorrow's confrontation pressing down on her. But for the first time since Joseph's death, she didn't feel alone in facing it. Whatever came next, they would face it together. This unlikely family bound by survival and something deeper, something that was slowly transforming from gratitude and respect into genuine love. Harold Bancroft arrived at noon in his polished carriage, looking thoroughly out of place against the stark desert landscape. The banker was a portly man in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit that was already darkening with sweat stains despite the early hour. Rose watched him approach from the porch, her stomach tight with anxiety. Beside her, Seko stood silent and still, his presence a steadying force, even though she'd asked him to remain hidden during this meeting. "Mrs. Whitaker," Bancroft said, removing his hat as he stepped down from the carriage. His driver, a young man with nervous eyes, stayed with the horses. "I trust you received my notice." "I did, Mr. Bancroft," Rose replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. Please, come inside out of the sun." Bancroft's eyes flickered to Seko, his expression tightening with disapproval, but he followed Rose into the modest adobe house. She'd prepared Joseph's account books, such as they were, and laid them out on the table, along with what little money she'd managed to save. $4.32 looked even more pathetic spread out on the worn wood. "As you can see," Rose began, "I don't have the full payment. But our new well is producing good water now, and with the recent rains, I expect the garden to recover. If you could extend the deadline another 3 months, Mrs. Whitaker," Bancroft interrupted, not unkindly, but with the firm tone of a man delivering bad news. We've already extended your deadline twice. The bank has been more than patient considering your circumstances. But patience has its limits. I'm afraid I need payment in full by the end of this week, or the bank will be forced to foreclose. 1 week. Rose felt the room tilt slightly. Mr. Bancroft, that's impossible. There's no way I can raise that kind of money in 1 week. I'm sorry, truly I am, Bancroft said, and he did look genuinely uncomfortable. But you must understand, the bank has obligations too. We can't continue to carry debts indefinitely. Perhaps you should consider selling the property yourself before foreclosure. You'd get a better price that way, have something to start over with somewhere else. This land is all we have, Rose said, her voice breaking despite her efforts to remain composed. My husband built this homestead with his own hands. He's buried here. I can't just abandon it. Bancroft's expression softened slightly, but his resolve didn't waver. Sentiment doesn't pay mortgages, Mrs. Whittaker. I'll give you until Friday. That's 5 days. If you can't make payment by then, the property reverts to the bank. After Bancroft had left, Rose sat at the table with her head in her hands, despair washing over her in waves. 5 days. How was she supposed to raise $60 in 5 days? It might as well be 6,000. She'd sold everything of value they owned. There was nothing left. There is always a way, Siko's voice came from the doorway. He'd been listening, as she'd known he would. We just must find it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Find what? Rose asked bitterly. I have no money, no assets, nothing to sell. The land itself is the only thing of value, and that's exactly what they want to take. Siko moved into the room and knelt beside her chair, his dark eyes intense. You have knowledge now. Knowledge I have taught you. Knowledge worth more than paper money. Rose looked at him in confusion. What are you talking about? The cattle ranchers, Siko said, his mind clearly working through a plan. The big ones who run thousands of head across the territory. They lose many animals each year to sickness, to drought, to not knowing where water runs. What if you could show them? What if Rose Whittaker becomes the woman who finds water where others fail? Understanding began to dawn. You want me to hire myself out as a water finder? Not just water, Siko continued, warming to his idea. You know now how to read the land, how to find the best grazing areas, how to predict where storms will bring rain. These are valuable skills. Ranchers would pay for such knowledge. They'd never listen to a woman, Rose protested. And even if they would, I don't have enough time. 5 days, Siko. How am I supposed to find clients, prove myself, and earn $60 in 5 days? We start with the biggest ranch, Siko said firmly. The Circle T. They run cattle from here to the Rio Grande. Their owner, Thomas Kincaid, he is smart man, not like others who see only what they expect to see. If we convince him, others will follow. And how exactly do we convince him? Rose asked, though she could feel hope beginning to kindle despite her skepticism. Siko smiled, that rare expression that transformed his whole face. We show him. Tomorrow, we ride to Circle T. We find water on his land that his own men cannot find. We prove that what you know is worth more than what others believe about women and Indians. That evening, Rose explained the plan to Caleb, who listened with growing excitement. So we're going to find water for Mr. Kincaid. Mama, that's brilliant. Everyone knows he's been struggling with his eastern pastures. If we can help him, he might pay us enough to save our land, Rose finished. But it's a gamble, Caleb. If we fail, we'll have wasted precious time we could have spent trying other solutions. We won't fail, Caleb said with the absolute confidence of youth. Seko's never been wrong about water yet. Why would he start now? The next morning, they set out before dawn, riding double on their old mare, while Siko moved alongside on foot with the effortless endurance Rose had come to expect from him. The Circle T headquarters was a day's ride north, a sprawling complex of buildings that spoke of prosperity and power. As they approached, Rose felt her courage faltering. What was she thinking? A poor widow coming to one of the territory's wealthiest ranchers with an outrageous proposition. You doubt yourself, Seiko observed, reading her expression with ease. "This is fear talking. Remember, you have survived husband's death, drought, soldiers, hostile neighbors. You can survive one rich man's skepticism." Thomas Kincaid was not what Rose expected. Instead of the gruff, dismissive cattleman she'd imagined, he was a tall, thoughtful man in his 40s, with intelligent eyes, and a manner that suggested he listened before judging. When Rose explained her proposal, he didn't laugh or dismiss her outright. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and studied her with frank curiosity. "Water finding," he said slowly. "Mrs. Whitaker, I've had 3 different dowsers come through here in the past 2 years. All of them promised they could find water in my eastern section. All of them failed. Why should I believe you're any different because I don't use divining rods or mystical nonsense?" Rose said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I use observation, knowledge of plants and geology, understanding of how water moves through the land. My teacher," she gestured to Seiko, "learned these skills from his people who've survived in this desert for centuries. I'm offering you real knowledge, Mr. Kincaid, not superstition." Kincaid's eyes moved to Seiko, taking in his Comanche appearance without apparent prejudice. "And you're Comanche?" he stated matter-of-factly. "Yes," Seiko replied calmly. "My people know this land like you know your own hand. We know where water runs, where grass grows best, where cattle will thrive. This knowledge I give to Rose Whitaker." "Why?" Kincaid asked bluntly. "Why would you share your people's knowledge with settlers?" "Because Rose Whitaker saved Seiko's life when she could have let me die," Seiko said simply. "Because honor demands that debts be repaid. Because sharing knowledge makes it grow, not diminish." Kincaid was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming on his desk. Finally he stood. "All right, Mrs. Whitaker, I'll give you a chance, but only one. My foreman has been trying to find water in the eastern pasture for months. If you can find a good source within 3 days, I'll pay you $100. If you can't, you leave empty-handed. Do we have a deal?" Rose's heart leaped. $100 would not only save their land, but give them a cushion for the future. "We have a deal," she said, extending her hand. Kincaid shook it firmly, his grip strong but not crushing. "My foreman will take you out there this afternoon," Kincaid said. "You'll have access to whatever tools and labor you need. I hope you're as good as you claim, Mrs. Whitaker, because that section is costing me a fortune in lost grazing land." The foreman, a weathered man named Dutch Henderson, was less welcoming than his employer. He made no secret of his skepticism as he led them to the eastern pasture, a vast expanse of brown grass and desperate cattle. "Mr. Kincaid's too soft-hearted," he muttered, "letting a woman and an Indian waste the rancher's time. But orders are orders." Rose ignored his hostility and began surveying the land with Seiko at her side. They walked for hours, Seiko teaching her to see what he saw, to read the subtle signs that spoke of water's presence. Caleb followed eagerly, his young eyes sharp and observant, often spotting details that Rose herself missed. "There," Seiko said finally, pointing to a slight depression in the land where a cluster of cottonwood saplings struggled to survive. "Water runs beneath this place, deep but strong. If you dig here, you will not reach water in 3 days." He moved 50 yards to the west, where the ground was rockier. "But here water comes closer to surface. Old stream bed buried by time but still carrying water beneath. Dig here." Rose studied the spot, applying everything Seiko had taught her. The rocks were a particular type that indicated ancient water flow. The soil, when she dug down a few inches, was slightly darker than the surrounding earth. Small ants had built a mound nearby, and Seiko had taught her that ants sought moisture. All the signs pointed to water. "This is the spot," she told Dutch, her voice confident despite her internal nervousness. "Start digging here?" Dutch looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "Ma'am, with all due respect, there's nothing but rock here. You sure you don't want to try that lower ground where the trees are?" "The trees are there because water runs deep below them," Rose explained. "But we don't have time to dig that deep. This spot will give us water within 2 days, maybe less." Dutch shook his head but called over his work crew. "Boss said to do what she says, so we dig. But when we hit nothing but rock, don't say I didn't warn you. The first day of digging was brutal. The workers hit rock layers that had to be broken through, and Dutch's skepticism infected the crew. Rose could hear their muttered complaints, their jokes about crazy widows and Indian magic. But Seko remained unshakable in his certainty, and his confidence bolstered hers. On the second day, as the sun climbed toward noon and the workers' grumbling grew louder, one of the diggers suddenly shouted, "We hit mud! There's moisture here." Within an hour, they'd broken through to water. It came up strong and clean, filling the bottom of the well faster than anyone had expected. Dutch Henderson stood at the edge, staring down in disbelief. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "She actually found it." Word spread quickly through the ranch. By evening, Thomas Kincaid himself had ridden out to inspect the new well. He stood there watching water flow, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, turning to Rose, "you've just saved me thousands of dollars in lost cattle and wasted grazing land. $100 seems like a bargain." "It's a fair price for fair work," Rose replied, trying to keep the trembling relief from her voice. $100. More than enough to pay the bank and have money left over. But Kincaid wasn't finished. "I'm thinking this is more than a one-time arrangement. I've got 3 other sections that could use water surveys. And I know at least a dozen ranchers who'd pay good money for someone who actually knows what they're doing. Mrs. Whitaker, how would you feel about making this a regular business?" Rose felt Caleb's hand slip into hers, squeezing tight with excitement. "A business?" she repeated, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "A consulting business," Kincaid elaborated. "You'd survey land for ranchers, help them find water, identify good grazing areas, maybe even advise on herd management. I'd be willing to put the word out, vouch for your abilities. You'd have more work than you could handle." Rose looked at Seko, whose eyes shone with quiet pride. This was what he'd envisioned, what he'd known was possible when she'd been drowning in despair. "I'd need to think about it," she said carefully. "Discuss it with my family?" "Of course," Kincaid said, "but don't think too long. Opportunity doesn't wait forever." He pulled out a leather wallet and counted out bills. "Here's your 100, plus an extra 20 for finishing a day early. And Mrs. Whitaker? Thank you. You've reminded me that wisdom comes from unexpected places." That night, camped under the stars on their way home, Rose counted the money again, still unable to believe it was real. $120, enough to save their land, buy supplies, see them through until the next opportunity. Caleb was already asleep, exhausted from the excitement, but Rose and Seko sat by the small fire, talking quietly. "You did this," Rose said, looking at Seko in the firelight. "You saved us. Again." "We did this," Seko corrected. "You had courage to try, to risk failure. That is the hard part. Seko only showed you what was always there to see." Rose reached out and took his hand, a gesture that would have seemed too forward just weeks ago, but now felt natural. "When you're fully healed, when you're strong enough, to travel back to your people, what will you do?" Seko was quiet for a long moment, his thumb absently tracing circles on her palm. "Seko has been thinking about this," he admitted. "My band, they move with the seasons, follow the buffalo herds that grow smaller each year. They are hunted by blue coats, pushed onto smaller and smaller lands. Soon there will be no place left. For the old ways, are you saying you want to stay?" Rose asked, her heart beating faster. "Seko is saying that he has found something here worth staying for," he replied, meeting her eyes. "Found family where he expected only enemies, found purpose where he expected only death, found—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "Found heart healing in place he did not expect." Rose felt tears gathering but didn't look away. "The town won't accept you, you know that. Martha Jenkins and her kind, they'll make life difficult. Life is always difficult," Seko said with a slight smile. "Question is not whether life is easy or hard. Question is whether it has meaning, whether it has love. Here with you and Caleb, Seko has found both. Before Rose could respond, could articulate the feelings that were rising in her chest like a tide, a sound broke the night's stillness. Horses, moving fast, coming from the direction of their homestead. Both of them were on their feet instantly, Seiko's hand moving to the knife at his belt. A rider burst into their camp, one of Kincaid's ranch hands, his horse lathered with sweat. "Mrs. Whitaker," he gasped, "Mr. Kincaid sent me to find you. There's trouble at your place. The army's there, soldiers everywhere, and they're saying you're harboring a hostile. They've got orders to search the property and arrest anyone found with Indians." Rose felt ice flood her veins. The army, at their home, with Caleb there alone. "We have to go back," she said, already moving toward their horse. "No," Seiko said firmly, catching her arm. "That is what they want. They use boy as bait to catch Seiko. If you go back, they arrest you. Too, maybe hurt Caleb to make you talk. I can't leave him there alone," Rose cried, panic rising. "Seiko, he's my son. And he is smart boy who knows how to hide, who knows where the cave is," Seiko reminded her. "We taught him for exactly this reason. He will be safe if you trust what we taught him." The ranch hand interrupted. "Mister, Kincaid said to tell you he sent his own men to watch your property, make sure the boy's not harmed. He says the army's got no right to terrorize a child, and he's prepared to make that point clear if necessary." Rose stood frozen between terror for her son and trust in Seiko's wisdom. Every maternal instinct screamed at her to race back home, to put herself between Caleb and danger. But the rational part of her mind knew Seiko was right. If she returned now, she'd only make things worse. "We go to Fort Davis," Seiko said decisively. "We go to the commander, tell truth. Rose found injured man, cared for him as Christian duty requires. Man recovered, stayed to repay debt by teaching survival skills. Nothing in this is crime." "You'll be arrested," Rose protested. "Seiko, they'll put you in chains, maybe hang you for those teamsters they think you killed." "Maybe," Seiko agreed calmly. "But if Seiko runs, they hunt you and Caleb forever. If Seiko faces them with truth, with you beside him telling your story, maybe there is chance. It is risk. But sometimes risk is necessary." Rose looked at this man who had appeared in her. Life like a gift from heaven, who had taught her son to be strong, who had shown her how to survive and even thrive in this harsh land. The thought of losing him, of watching him be taken away in chains, was almost more than she could bear. But she also knew he was right. Running would solve nothing. They had to face this, together, with the truth as their only weapon. "Then we face them," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "But we do it my way. We go to Fort Davis, yes, but first we stop at every ranch between here and there. We gather witnesses, people who've seen what you've done for us, who can testify to your character. We make it impossible for them to paint you as just another hostile Indian." Seiko's expression softened with something that looked very much like love. "Rose Whitaker fights like Comanche warrior," he said, "uses every weapon available, never surrenders even when odds are against her. Seiko is honored to stand beside such a woman." As they prepared to ride through the night toward an uncertain confrontation and a future that hung in the balance, Rose felt a strange calm settling over her. They had come so far together, overcome so many obstacles. Whatever happened next, they would face it the same way they'd faced everything else, with courage, with honor, and with the unshakable bond that had formed between three broken people, who'd found healing in each other's strength. The ride to Fort Davis took them through 3 ranches before dawn broke over the Texas horizon. At each stop, Rose told their story while Seiko stood silent and dignified beside her. Thomas Kincaid was the first to pledge his support, writing a detailed letter attesting to Seiko's character and the valuable service he'd provided. The owner of the Bar W Ranch, a grizzled veteran named Marcus Webb, who'd initially greeted them with a shotgun, listened to Rose's account and surprised them both by offering to ride with them to the fort. "I've fought Comanche," Webb said gruffly, "and I've fought alongside them back in the Mexican War. A man's a man, regardless of his blood. If this one saved you and your boy, helped you build something instead of destroying it, then he deserves a fair hearing. I'll see he gets it." By the time they reached Fort Davis, the sun was high, and they had 5 ranchers riding with them, each one carrying written testimony of Seiko's conduct. Rose's hands trembled as they approached the main gate, but she sat tall in her saddle, refusing to show the fear that churned in her stomach. Somewhere behind those walls, decisions were being made that could tear apart everything they'd built. Commander Douglas Pierce was a career military man in his 50s, with grey hair and the weary eyes of someone who'd seen too much violence. He received them in his office, his expression neutral as he listened to Rose's carefully prepared statement. Seiko stood at attention, his bearing proud despite the obvious danger he faced. "Mrs. Whitaker," Pierce said when she'd finished, "you're asking me to believe that you stumbled upon a wounded Comanche warrior and out of pure Christian charity nursed him back to health, that he then stayed on your property for weeks, teaching you and your son survival skills, and never once posed a threat to you or anyone else in the territory?" "That's exactly what I'm asking you to believe, Commander," Rose replied steadily, "because it's the truth. Seiko was dying when my son found him. We helped him because it was the right thing to do, not because we expected anything in return. Everything that came after, his teachings, his help with our land, was his choice, his way of honoring a debt. He felt he owed a debt," Pierce repeated, his eyes moving to Seiko. "And what about the debt you owe to your people, to the warriors who ride with you? We have reports of Comanche raids continuing throughout the territory. How do we know you weren't gathering intelligence, planning attacks?" "Seiko does not ride with war parties anymore," Seiko spoke for the first time, his English careful but clear. "When my wife and daughter died from the sickness that came from white man's forts, part of me died too. I rode into battle seeking death, not victory. The night blue coat shot me. I was alone, separated from my band, not thinking clearly. Rose Whitaker did not save a warrior. She saved a broken man who had lost his reason to live." Something in his words, in the raw honesty of his admission, made Pierce pause. The commander leaned back in his chair, studying them both with sharp intelligence. "And now, have you found a reason to live?" Seiko's eyes moved to Rose, and the tenderness in his gaze was unmistakable. "Yes," he said simply. "I have found family where I did not expect it. Found purpose in teaching instead of fighting. Have found that perhaps there is path forward that does not require more death, more loss." Pierce was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to his sergeant. "Bring in the boy." Rose's heart lurched as the door opened and Caleb was escorted in, looking tired but unharmed. He ran to his mother immediately, and Rose crushed him in an embrace, checking him frantically for any signs of mistreatment. "I'm okay, Mama," Caleb said, though his voice shook slightly. "Mr. Kincaid's men stayed with me the whole time. The soldiers searched the house, but they didn't hurt anything. I hid Seiko's bow and his other things in the cave, just like we practiced." "Good boy," Rose whispered, smoothing his hair. "You did so good." Pierce cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to him. "Young man," he addressed Caleb directly, "I need you to tell me the truth. Has this Comanche warrior ever threatened you or your mother? Has he ever hurt you or made you afraid?" Caleb pulled away from Rose and looked the commander straight in the eye. "No, sir," he said firmly. "Seiko saved us. We were starving, Commander Pierce. Our well was dry, our garden was dead, and Mama was trying so hard, but we were going to lose everything. Seiko showed us how to find water, how to hunt properly, how to read the land. He taught me things my papa didn't have time to teach me before he died. He's been nothing but kind and patient and honorable." "The boy speaks from the heart," Marcus Webb interjected, stepping forward. "And he's not alone in his testimony. I've got 4 other ranchers out here who'll tell you the same thing. This Comanche's done more good for this territory in a few weeks than most settlers manage in years." Pierce stood and walked to the window, his back to them, as he considered. The silence stretched, broken only by the sounds of the fort beyond the office walls. Finally, he turned back to face them. "Mrs. Whitaker, I'm going to be frank with you. Officially, I should arrest this man. He's Comanche. We're at war with the Comanche, and harboring enemy combatants is a serious offense. However," he held up a hand as Rose started to protest, "I'm also a practical man. I've read the testimonials your rancher friends provided. I've spoken with Lieutenant Garrett, who reported finding only a fevered sick man at your property weeks ago. And I've just heard testimony from your son that contradicts any notion of hostile intent." He moved back to his desk and sat down, looking suddenly tired. "The truth is, Mrs. Whitaker, this war is ending. The Comanche way of life is ending, whether any of us like it or not. The buffalo are nearly gone. The land is being carved up by settlers and ranchers, and soon there won't be any place left for the old ways. What you're describing, a Comanche choosing to live peacefully, to contribute to the community rather than fight against it, that might be the only path forward for his people." "So you're letting him go?" Rose asked, afraid to hope. "I'm letting him go," Pierce confirmed, "on several conditions. First, he registers with this fort. I need to know where he is and what he's doing. Second, he causes no trouble. One incident, one complaint, and I'll have no choice but to bring him in. And third," he looked at Siko directly, "you help me convince others of your people that there's a better way. That cooperation with settlers doesn't mean surrender of identity, just adaptation to changing times." Siko met the commander's gaze steadily. "Siko cannot speak for all Comanche," he said. "Cannot promise that others will follow the path I have chosen. But I can promise to live with honor, to harm no one who does not harm me first, and to show by example that there is way to preserve what matters while accepting what must change." Pierce nodded slowly. "That's all any of us can do." He pulled out a document and began writing. "I'm issuing you a passage permit. It gives you legal right to move freely in this territory, as long as you're in the company of Mrs. Whitaker or working under the auspices of her new consulting business." "Yes," he added, seeing Rose's surprise. "Word travels fast. Thomas Kincaid made quite a point of telling me how you found water where his own experts had failed. Seems to me you're providing a valuable service." Rose felt tears of relief sliding down her cheeks. "Thank you, Commander. You don't know what this means." "I think I do," Pierce said quietly. "I think you've all been through enough hardship without the army adding to it. Go home, Mrs. Whitaker. Take care of your family. And Siko," he added as they turned to leave, "welcome to the harder battle. Living in peace requires more courage than making war." The ride back to their homestead was jubilant despite their exhaustion. Caleb rode with Siko, chattering excitedly about everything that had happened, while Rose followed on their mare, her heart so full she could barely breathe. They'd done it. Against all odds, they'd faced down the army and won. More than that, they'd won the right to continue building the life they'd started, the strange and beautiful family they'd become. When they crested the final hill and saw their adobe house below, Rose was surprised to see several wagons parked outside. As they drew closer, she recognized Thomas Kincaid's rig, along with Marcus Webb's buckboard and others she didn't immediately place. A crowd of people stood in front of the house, and Rose's first instinct was alarm, but then she saw they were working, unloading supplies from the wagons. "What's all this?" she asked as Kincaid approached with a wide grin. "This," Kincaid said grandly, "is the territory welcoming its newest business. Word got out about what you did at my ranch, and suddenly every cattleman within 50 miles wants to hire you. I took the liberty of accepting jobs on your behalf and collecting deposits. Hope you don't mind." He handed Rose a leather pouch that jingled with coins. When she opened it, her eyes widened at the amount. "This is too much," she protested. "It's exactly right," Kincaid countered. "You've got water surveys lined up for the next 3 months, Mrs. Whitaker, plus consulting jobs on herd management and land assessment. You're going to be busier than you ever imagined. So we," he gestured to the other ranchers, "decided you'd need some help getting established. New tools, proper surveying equipment, supplies to see you through while you're working. Consider it an investment in our collective future." Rose looked at the supplies being carefully stacked by her house, at the friendly faces of people who weeks ago would have shunned her, and felt overwhelmed by the generosity. "I don't know what to say. Say you'll do good work," Marcus Webb called out. "And maybe teach some of us old dogs a few new tricks about reading the land." As the sun began to set, the ranchers departed one by one, each offering congratulations and confirmation of their upcoming appointments. When the last wagon had rolled away, Rose stood with Seiko and Caleb in front of their home, looking at the transformation that had taken place. Their struggling homestead now had the tools and supplies to become something more, something sustainable. "Mama," Caleb said quietly, "does this mean we're going to be okay? Really okay?" Rose pulled her son close, then reached out to include Seiko in their embrace. "Yes, baby," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We're going to be more than okay. We're going to thrive." That evening, after Caleb had fallen asleep, exhausted by the day's events, Rose and Seiko sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. The night air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of the desert after a brief evening shower. Everything felt different now, charged with possibility instead of weighted with despair. "Seiko has been thinking," he said after a long silence, "about what Commander Pierce said, about adaptation, about preserving what matters while accepting change." "What have you been thinking?" Rose asked, turning to look at him. "That perhaps Comanche way and White way are not so different at their heart," Seiko replied. "Both value family, honor, courage. Both teach children to be strong, to respect the land. The methods are different, the languages are different, but the core is same." He reached out and took Rose's hand, his touch gentle but firm. "Rose Whitaker, when you found Seiko dying beneath the cottonwood tree, you saw not an enemy, but a human soul in need. This simple act of seeing truly, of looking past fear and prejudice to recognize shared humanity, this is what changed everything, not just for Seiko, but for all of us." Rose felt her heart racing as Seiko shifted to face her fully, his dark eyes intense in the starlight. "In Comanche tradition," he continued, "when a warrior chooses to leave his band and join another, there is ceremony. He brings gifts to show his worth, demonstrates his skills, and asks to be accepted as family. Seiko has done these things. He has brought knowledge, has proven his value, has stood beside you through danger." "What are you saying?" Rose whispered, though she thought she knew. "Seiko is saying that he wishes to stay, not as guest or teacher, but as family," he said simply. "In Comanche way, Seiko would ask for right to court you, to prove himself worthy of becoming your husband, becoming father to Caleb. But Seiko does not know White way, does not know if this is acceptable, if widow can marry warrior from another people." Rose felt tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "In White way," she said softly, "a widow can marry whomever she chooses, if her heart is true, and the man is honorable. And Seiko, you are the most honorable man I've ever known." "Then you would consider," he began. But Rose stopped him with a finger pressed gently to his lips. "I would more than consider," she said. "I would say yes. Yes to building a life together. Yes to blending our worlds and our ways. Yes to showing Caleb and everyone else that love and family transcend the boundaries people try to draw between cultures." Seiko's face transformed with a smile so radiant it took Rose's breath away. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch reverent, and kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of patience and passion held carefully in check. When they finally drew apart, both were trembling. "We will face challenges," Seiko said seriously. "There will be those who disapprove, who say this union is wrong. Some of Seiko's people will say he has betrayed them. Some of your people will say you have disgraced yourself." "Let them say what they want," Rose replied firmly. "We'll prove them wrong by living well, by raising Caleb to be proud of both his heritages, by building something that honors both our pasts while creating something new for the future." They sat together under the vast Texas sky, planning their future in whispers and shared dreams. They would marry in both traditions, Comanche and Christian, honoring both their worlds. They would expand their consulting business, teaching others the wisdom Seiko had shared with Rose. They would make their homestead a place where different cultures could meet and learn from each other, a bridge between worlds that so often saw only enemies. 3 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Rose Whitaker and Seiko stood before a gathering of ranchers, townspeople, and a small group of Comanche, including some of Seiko's distant relatives. Reverend Matthews performed the Christian ceremony, his old voice strong as he spoke of love transcending all boundaries. Then, under the cottonwood tree where Caleb had first found Seiko dying, a Comanche elder conducted the traditional ceremony. Binding their hands with leather cord decorated with beads and feathers, Caleb stood between them, his hand resting on the small leather pouch that now hung around his own neck. A gift from Seiko containing a lock of his father Joseph's hair and a feather from Seiko's first successful hunt. He wore both his father's name and Seiko's teachings with equal pride, a living symbol of the family they'd become. Thomas Kincaid stood as witness, along with Marcus Webb and Commander Pierce, who'd come in unofficial capacity to show his support. Even Martha Jenkins was there, her expression still disapproving but softened slightly by the undeniable happiness radiating from the bride and groom. As Seiko kissed his new wife, the gathered crowd erupted in cheers that echoed across the desert. Rose looked at the faces surrounding them, at the mixture of cultures and backgrounds united in celebration, and felt a profound sense of rightness. This was what the future could look like, she thought. Not the erasure of differences, but the honoring of them. Not the domination of one way over another, but the blending of wisdom from all sources. That night, as the celebration wound down and the last guests departed, Rose stood with Seiko and Caleb looking out over their land. The new well they dug was producing steady water. The garden was flourishing under Seiko's guidance. The homestead that had nearly been lost to foreclosure was now the headquarters of a thriving consulting business that had clients lined up for months. "Tell me the story again, Mama," Caleb said, though he'd heard it dozens of times. "About the day I found Seiko." Rose smiled and pulled her son close, while Seiko's arm came around her shoulders. "It was a hot afternoon in August," she began, "and you came riding up on the neighbor's horse, your face pale with fear and excitement, telling me about a dying man by the cottonwood tree, and you went to help him," Caleb continued, picking up the familiar thread, even though he was Comanche and it was dangerous, because Papa always said every life has value, and your mother saved Seiko's life, Seiko added, his voice warm with the memory, not knowing that in saving one broken warrior, she was saving herself and her son too. Not knowing that act of mercy would change all our destinies, and we became a family, Caleb finished, the three of us together, different from other families, but just as real, just as strong. Rose looked at her husband and her son, at the life they'd built from desperation and grace, and knew that this was the story she would tell for the rest of her days. The story of how mercy had transformed into love, how enemies had become family, how the simple choice to see the humanity in another person had opened doors to possibilities she'd never imagined. Years later, when Caleb was grown and running the consulting business himself, when the Whitaker-Seiko homestead had become known throughout Texas as a place of learning and cultural exchange, when Rose and Seiko sat on their porch watching their grandchildren play, Rose would think back to that scorching August afternoon when her son had come riding up with news of a dying stranger. She would remember her fear, her hesitation, and her ultimate choice to help despite the risks. She would remember Seiko's teachings, his patience, his honor. She would remember the moment she'd realized that saving his life had been the first step in saving her own. And she would be grateful, profoundly grateful, that she'd chosen mercy over fear, love over hatred, hope over despair, because in the end, that choice had given her everything. A partner who understood both strength and gentleness, a son who walked proudly between two worlds, a life filled with purpose and meaning, a legacy that would ripple forward through generations, proving that the barriers between people are never as solid as they seem, that love can bridge any divide, and that sometimes the greatest treasures come disguised as the most desperate circumstances. The struggling widow and her son had rescued a dying Comanche, not knowing he would repay them beyond measure. But the truth, as Rose came to understand, was that they had all rescued each other. In choosing to see past their differences to their shared humanity, in choosing to build together instead of remaining apart, they had created something far more valuable than gold or land or status. They had created a family bound not by blood or culture, but by choice, by respect, by love, and that, Rose knew as she sat beside her husband under the Texas stars, was the greatest treasure of all. 5 years had passed since that scorching August afternoon when Caleb Whitaker found a dying Comanche warrior beneath the cottonwood tree. The small, struggling homestead had transformed into something far beyond what anyone could have imagined back in those desperate days of 1867. The Whitaker-Seco Ranch now sprawled across 800 acres of prime Texas grazing land. But it was known throughout the territory not for its size or wealth, but for something far more remarkable. It had become a school. Not a traditional school with rigid walls and strict curriculum, but a living classroom where young people from both settler and native communities came to learn the skills that transcended cultural boundaries. Water finding, land management, animal husbandry, tracking, survival skills, and most importantly, the art of seeing past differences to recognize shared humanity. Rose and Seco had built something unprecedented, a bridge between worlds that had been at war for generations. On this particular autumn morning in 1872, Rose stood at the window of their expanded ranch house, watching students move between the various teaching stations scattered across the property. Her hair showed only hints of silver now at 37, pulled back in the same practical bun she'd always favored, but her eyes carried a depth of wisdom that came from surviving hardship and choosing hope. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who'd earned respect through deeds rather than demands. Seco appeared beside her, his own frame still strong and vital at 43, moving with the same fluid grace that had marked him even when he'd been wounded and dying 5 years earlier. A few silver strands touched his temples, but his eyes remained sharp and his spirit vibrant. He placed a hand on Rose's shoulder, and she covered it with her own, the gesture as natural as breathing after 4 years of marriage. "Caleb rides in from the northern section," Seco observed, nodding toward the distant figure. "He brings good news, I think." His face shows pride. Rose felt her heart lift at the sight of her son. At 16, Caleb had grown tall and strong, no longer the frightened 11-year-old boy who'd discovered a dying stranger 5 years ago. He embodied the best of both his father's legacies, carrying Joseph's steady reliability and gentle humor, combined with Seco's deep understanding of the land and respect for all forms of wisdom. He was already handling consulting jobs on his own, his reputation for finding water and reading land spreading across the territory. Caleb dismounted and bounded up the porch steps with youthful energy, his face indeed glowing with excitement. "The Henderson Ranch job is done," he announced. "Found 3 water sources where they'd given up looking. Mr. Henderson paid double what we quoted and already referred us to 2 more ranches." "Well done, son," Rose said, pride swelling in her chest. "Your father would be so proud. Both my fathers," Caleb corrected with a grin, moving to clasp Seco's shoulder in the affectionate gesture that had become natural between them. "Seco's teachings made it possible. I just applied what he showed me." Seco's eyes shone with emotion at Caleb's words. In 5 years, the boy had become the son he'd lost when his own daughter died, filling a void neither of them had expected to heal. "You apply wisdom well," Seco said. "This is greatest teaching success, when student becomes master." Rose watched the easy affection between her husband and son, marveling at how life had unfolded. When she'd made the choice to help a dying stranger 5 years ago, she'd been motivated by simple human decency and the values Joseph had instilled in her. She couldn't have known then that this single act of mercy would ripple forward through time, touching dozens of lives and changing the very fabric of their community. Later that evening, after the students had been settled and dinner had been shared around the long communal table that could seat 20, Rose found herself in the small library that had grown from a single shelf to a full room. She pulled down her journal, its leather cover worn from frequent use, and opened to the entry dated August 15th, 1867. Her younger self's handwriting filled the page, shaky with exhaustion and fear. Today, Caleb found a dying man by the cottonwood tree. I should be terrified. Instead, I feel strangely calm, as if some greater purpose is at work. Joseph would have helped this stranger. How can I do any less? You still read the old entries? Siko's voice came from the doorway. He entered and settled beside his wife, his hand finding hers with familiar ease. I like to remember where we started, Rose said softly. 5 years ago we were starving, desperate, about to lose everything. Now look at what we've built. Siko squeezed her hand gently. We built it together. Rose's mercy gave Siko life. Seko's knowledge gave Rose's family survival. Caleb's open heart gave us all hope. This is how family should be, each one lifting the others. Through the window, they could see Caleb sitting by the fire pit with a group of students, demonstrating tracking techniques with the same patience Siko had shown him. Some of the young people were settlers' children, others were Comanche or Apache, all learning to see the world through multiple perspectives. A rider appeared on the horizon, and Rose recognized the uniform of Fort Davis. She and Seko went out to the porch, old caution never quite forgotten, despite 5 years of peace. The soldier who approached was Commander Pierce himself, now showing more gray in his hair, but still carrying the same thoughtful bearing. Mrs. Whitaker Seko. Seko? Pierce greeted them warmly, dismounting. I wanted to deliver this news personally. The territorial governor has officially recognized your school. You're being granted additional land rights and a charter to expand your educational programs. What you've built here has become a model for the entire territory. Rose felt tears prick her eyes. Commander, we never expected recognition. We were just trying to survive, to build something good. That's exactly why you deserve recognition, Pierce replied. 5 years ago, I took a risk, letting Seko go free. Best decision I ever made. What you three have proven, that different cultures can not just coexist, but strengthen each other. That's the future of this territory. After Pierce had departed, Rose stood between Seko and Caleb, who joined them on the porch. They looked out over the ranch that had become so much more than any of them had imagined. Students were settling in for the evening, their voices a mixture of languages, creating a beautiful tapestry of sound. Do you ever regret it? Rose asked Seko quietly. Choosing to stay here instead of returning to your people? Seko considered the question seriously. Seko does not see it as leaving behind, he said finally. The skills I teach, the wisdom I share, these are Comanche ways. They live on through every student. My daughter's spirit lives in every child who learns to read the land. My wife's values live in the respect we teach. He turned to look at Rose, his dark eyes still capable of making her heart flutter after 4 years of marriage. And I have found new family, new purpose, new love. The old ways do not die here. They transform, they grow stronger by joining with other ways. This is survival in its highest form. Caleb stood tall beside them. I used to think I had to choose between honoring Papa's memory and learning from Seko. Now I understand I can honor both. They both taught me that strength comes from compassion, that wisdom comes from listening, that family is built through choice and love. Rose felt her heart swell with love for both her men. 5 years ago, she'd been a desperate widow on the brink of losing everything. Now she stood with a husband who taught her to see the world with new eyes, and a son who was becoming a bridge builder between cultures. They'd taken tragedy and transformed it into hope, taken loss and transformed it into purpose. As the sun set over the Texas prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Rose Whitaker Seko thought about the journey that had brought them here. From that desperate August day, when a dying warrior had appeared at their doorstep, through years of struggle and growth, to this moment of peace and recognition. She thought about all the lives that had been touched, all the students who'd learned to see beyond boundaries, all the families who'd found hope in their example. The struggling widow and her son had rescued a dying Comanche, not knowing he would repay them beyond measure. But the real truth, Rose understood now, was that they had all rescued each other. In choosing mercy over fear, in choosing to build bridges rather than walls, in choosing to see the humanity in those who seemed different. They had created something that would outlast them all. A legacy of hope built not over decades, but in 5 short years that proved how quickly transformation could happen when people chose love over hatred. Understanding over fear, and unity over division. Their story was just beginning, and the best chapters were still to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.